let's jump right into this one. You know, the War of 1812 has to be one of the most bizarre, fascinating stories in modern history. Some folks back then actually called it the Second American Revolution. It was this massive clash between the young United States and the absolute powerhouse that was the United Kingdom. But here's the wild part. It started over issues that were actually already being resolved. It was fought with just stunning incompetence on both sides. We're talking dramatic victories, super embarrassing defeats, and a peace treaty that basically changed zero on paper. Literally a tie where nobody officially won. But as we're going to see as we walk through this story, the ripple effects of this totally misunderstood conflict, they ended up shaping the entire North American continent for centuries. So we'll be unfolding this narrative in 5 quick chapters. First, a war nobody quite wanted. Then we'll look at the absolute disasters on the frontier, followed by the capital in flames. After that, peace and a very late victory. And finally, we'll talk about the real losers and the legacy of it all. Let's get into it. Chapter 1. A war nobody quite wanted. To really get why this strange war even happened, we actually have to zoom out and look over at Europe. There's this massive, continent-spanning power struggle going on between Britain and Napoleon's France. And the young, commercially hungry United States, they got completely caught in an impossible economic squeeze between these two global giants. Now, the biggest grievance for the U.S. was incredibly personal and honestly visceral. It was a practice called impressment. Basically, the Royal Navy was just massive, right? And keeping those warships fully manned was a nightmare because of brutal conditions and skyrocketing desertion rates. So their solution? They just pull over American merchant ships, line up the crew, and forcefully kidnap anyone they claimed was a British subject to work on their warships. Between 1803 and 1812, press gangs snatched up somewhere between 6,000 and 9,000 Americans. And this all hit a boiling point in June 1807 with the Chesapeake Leopard affair. The British warship HMS Leopard literally intercepted the American frigate USS Chesapeake right off the coast of Virginia. They opened fire during peacetime, battered the American ship into submission, and hauled off 4 men. 3 of them were actually American-born. You can imagine the public outcry. It sparked an absolute, undeniable war fever. But here is where the story gets almost Shakespearean in its dark irony. By June 1812, things felt totally past the point of no return. But over in London, the British Parliament had actually decided to back down. They revoked the restrictive trade orders that were crippling the American economy. The catch? The speed of ocean travel. Nobody in Washington knew about it. Unaware that Britain had just caved, President James Madison asked Congress to declare war, and they did on June 18, 1812. And get this, it passed by the slimmest margin of any war declaration in U.S. history. The House was 79 to 49, the Senate just 19 to 13. By the time the ship carrying the news of the war declaration finally reached Britain in August, the trade restrictions had already been gone for weeks. If they just had the transatlantic telegraph, the whole thing might never have happened. All right, Chapter 2, Disasters on the Frontier. So pushed by this aggressive new generation of politicians known as the War Hawks, the American grand strategy was surprisingly simple: just invade Canada. The U.S. had a massive population advantage here. We're talking 7.7 million Americans compared to maybe 500,000 Canadians. So it was widely and, well, foolishly, assumed that U.S. troops would just waltz across the border and be greeted as liberators. Former President Thomas Jefferson actually captured this spectacular arrogance perfectly. He famously predicted that taking Canada would be nothing more than, quote, a mere matter of marching. I mean, wow. It seriously stands as one of the most spectacularly wrong military predictions ever. Because fighting at the end of stretched supply lines, through the brutal North American wilderness, against hardened British regulars and fierce Native American allies, yeah, that was going to be a totally different, brutal reality check. So that mere matter of marching almost immediately turned into just an absolute catalog of humiliation. In 1812, American armies tried invading Canada at 3 different points, and every single campaign was a catastrophic failure. One army tucked tail and withdrew north of New York after a tiny skirmish. Another completely surrendered at Queenston Heights. But the absolute worst of it? The surrender at Detroit. American General William Hull was so terrified of a massacre by the brilliant Shawnee leader Tecumseh and his warriors that he surrendered his entire force to British General Isaac Brock. And the kicker? Hull actually outnumbered the British. The young nation that had defeated the British Empire 30 years prior was getting completely routed in a war it had started itself. Now, if you look out on the ocean, the whole David and Goliath vibe is just wild. The U.S. Navy had 8 frigates, 14 sloops, and exactly 0 ships of the line. You know, those massive, heavily armed floating fortresses. The Royal Navy, they had over 600 ships. On paper, it's literally no contest. But in practice, the Americans kind of shocked the world. The USS Constitution famously went toe-to-toe with the HMS Guerriere. During that fight, British cannonballs literally bounced off the heavy oak hull of the American ship. That's where it got the immortal nickname Old Ironsides. Now, these stunning one-on-one ship duels didn't really change the strategic reality. The British Navy still eventually blockaded the coast and captured something like 1,400 American merchant ships. But man, did those victories give a desperate American public some heroes exactly when they needed them most. Moving to Chapter 3, the Capitol in Flames. The whole momentum of the war shifted violently in 1814. Over in Europe, Napoleon was finally defeated, which suddenly freed up thousands of battle-hardened British veterans to sail straight for North America. And this brings us to arguably the most traumatic episode of the whole story, August 1814. A British expeditionary force lands in Maryland. They easily brush aside American militias at the Battle of Bladensburg, and then they just march, practically unopposed, right into Washington, D.C. Now, earlier in the war, American forces had looted and burned York in Canada, so the British were out for revenge. They deliberately set fire to the Capitol building and the presidential mansion, which we now call the White House. It was chaos. First Lady Dolly Madison literally had to rescue a portrait of George Washington before fleeing right into the night. It was an incredibly profound, devastating humiliation for the United States. But the British didn't get to just march unchecked forever. When they pushed north to take Baltimore, they hit a brick wall of fierce, determined American resistance. Through this rainy, miserable night on September 13th, 1814, British warships just relentlessly bombarded Fort McHenry. And watching all of this from a British ship, where he was actually stuck trying to negotiate a prisoner release, was a young American lawyer named Francis Scott Key. When dawn finally broke, he saw the battered American flag still flying over the fort. That exact moment inspired him to write the poem that, as you probably know, eventually became the United States national anthem, the Star-Spangled Banner. Chapter 4. Peace and a Late Victory. By the time late 1814 rolled around, both sides were just completely exhausted. Pure war fatigue drove them all to the negotiating table in Ghent, Belgium. They signed the Treaty of Ghent on Christmas Eve in 1814, and guys, it was literally a total reset to zero. It restored all the political boundaries back to exactly how they were before the war started. Not a single inch of territory changed hands. And the most incredible part? Impressment, the kidnapping of sailors that caused America to declare war in the first place. It was completely ignored in the treaty. Neither side even brought it up. They basically just agreed to stop shooting at each other and figure out the rest later. 2,000. That is the number of British casualties at the Battle of New Orleans. And here is one of the greatest ironies in military history. The most famous American land victory of the entire war happened weeks after the peace treaty was already signed in Europe. News just traveled that slowly back then. On January 8, 1815, General Andrew Jackson led this incredibly ragtag mixed force, regular soldiers, frontiersmen, pirates, free black soldiers, against a highly seasoned British army. And it was a totally lopsided slaughter. The British suffered over 2,000 casualties, while the Americans lost fewer than 100 men. Militarily, it meant absolutely nothing for the peace treaty, but man, it made Andrew Jackson a national hero overnight. And it handed the Americans a glorious, triumphant storyline to cap off a war that was otherwise incredibly ambiguous. Which brings us to Chapter 5, the real losers and the legacy. Because while the colonial powers basically fought each other to a standstill, we have to take a really sober look at the people who undeniably lost this war. Completely woven into the War of 1812 was the desperate fight of Native American peoples to protect their homelands from the relentless expansion of American settlers. Indigenous groups had actually formed a powerful intertribal confederation. They allied with the British, hoping that a victory would result in an internationally recognized sovereign Native nation acting as a buffer state in the Northwest. But that hope tragically died in October 1813 at the Battle of the Thames, when the brilliant Shawnee leader Tecumseh was killed in combat. His death was a civilizational tragedy. It just completely shattered the dream of a unified Native front. And then, the Treaty of Ghent was the final betrayal. During negotiations, the British completely dropped their demands for a Native buffer state. So stripped of British backing, weapons, and money, Indigenous peoples were left to face an irreversible catastrophe. It basically opened the floodgates for unbounded American expansionism, forced marches, and systemic destruction in the decades that followed. So, after all that, it leaves us with this one lingering question.
who actually won the War of 1812? I mean, most scholars agree it was a complete stalemate between the colonial powers. The Americans utterly failed to conquer Canada. The British completely failed to impose their will on the US. Thousands of soldiers died for basically nothing that you could measure on a map. But the psychological outcomes, those were absolutely monumental.
The contrast in the aftermath is incredibly stark. For the United States, Britain, and Canada, the results were bizarrely positive. In America, it kicked off what was called the era of good feelings. It boosted national self-confidence and sparked an economic revival. For Canada, successfully fighting off an American invasion completely crystallized a proud, distinct national identity, entirely separate from both Britain and the US. And for Anglo-American relations, it eventually led to the longest unfortified, peaceful border in the world. They'd never go to war against each other again. But on the flip side, for Native Americans, it meant the total loss of European backing, which sparked relentless, unbounded US expansion and truly tragic, systemic destruction.
The War of 1812 leaves us with such a strange, frustrating, but absolutely fascinating legacy. Think about it. It started over trade restrictions that were already being repealed. It was declared over impressment, which didn't even make it into the final peace treaty. The invasion of Canada was a disaster, the US capital was literally burned to the ground, and the biggest victory happened after the war was legally over. So, how did a war that officially settled absolutely nothing end up permanently defining the map and the future of North America? It really is a testament to how the sheer chaos of history, full of all its blunders and miscommunications, somehow shapes the exact reality we live in today. Thanks for walking through this incredible story with me.